Good evening, everyone. It's Tom Sydney Bushnell, aka Numbers, here from Psych Club, the Tom Numbers Show, and News with Tom Numbers. And I've got my old pal. We haven't seen each other for a while, Juan, but welcome to the show, Mr. 107.
Yeah, it's good to talk with you. Yeah, we've both had very busy schedules, and so good to get a chance to visit again.
So, well, what have you got for us, buddy? There's a lot happening. I just saw some of President Trump's speech. I think it must have been from last night in South Dakota, in Rapid City. And that's a place I went to last year. I ended up there kind of serendipitously, accidentally. But I really enjoyed it there. And I was like, oh, that's good. Yeah. Rapid City, 48, 57, 105. Savior with the I, no, with the U, the English way. Turian. What else is it? It's a few things anyway. Yeah.
Well, a couple things about South Dakota.
11.5. Yeah, 11.5 as well. Yeah. Yeah, go on.
A couple things about South Dakota. You know, it has the lowest unemployment in the country. I think at 1.5 or 1.8% unemployment, and even that's questionable how many people are actually on it that just want to take a break from working. They have an amazing per capita income and like that, but it's related to, in large part, to energy with the oil projects there around the state, and but also they were a state that never went down the road of requiring economy continued to do well and prosper, and they also had, I believe, low. There was a lot to be said there, and then they also weren't pushing the
mandatory.
Yeah, and so, and of course,
might take us a few days to clean it for the youth. We'll get it on Rumble and Twitter and stuff. So yeah, say what you want to say, man. I'm kind of had enough of that. Well, it just slows things out because I know how the game is on the big one. But yeah, just say what you want to say. Interesting thing. Talking to the governor. So I've got to get this place right. I think is it Johnson Hotel, the big tall one in the middle of town in Rapid City. Johnson Hotel, I think it's called.
Yeah.
So I was I went there a couple of times, but the first night I went there, I think it was a Friday, Saturday. I can't remember. Anyway, it was busy. I went to the roof garden and I met Jamie, and I can't remember his name now, but he's the opposition to Curse, you know him, and he was telling me about his stuff, and we were getting on fine. And then I think he realized I wasn't for moving. So he just kind of exited the conversation after about 12, 15 minutes, suddenly just slipped away. What was his name? Jamie. Do you know the one I'm talking about? He's the Democrat. He was the one running against her. He was actually doing a debate that day, and big guy. He looks a bit like Alex Jones, but kind of maybe another 5 stone heavier. But he was a nice enough chap. I can't remember his name, Jamie. But yeah, and I said, oh, you should come on the show. And I looked at his Twitter. I think he's got maybe about 15,000 or so on Twitter. Anyway, he kind of realized, oh, this one's not good, because I was peppering him with a few things, and I think he said a couple of things about Trump, not really too derogatory, but I stuck up for President Trump, and I think he just realized this isn't gonna, so he just kind of exited. But he was a nice enough chap. Can't remember his name, Jamie someone. Yeah.
Well, let me just say this. For example, Bill Clinton. Bill's a super smart guy. He could read a spreadsheet better than just about anybody you'd know. He could look at a budget and what would take others days, he'd have down in 10, 15, 20 minutes, and he'd have a pretty good grasp on where things were at, where they were going. If you're going to sit down and have a beer with somebody, he'd be as fun and gregarious as anybody you'd ever meet. And he could have an intelligent conversation. You might not agree with him,
Yeah.
but he wasn't like he was, the enemy incarnate or something, the way he presented. And there's a lot of people out there, President Reagan would talk with the Tip O'Neill over at the House, the majority leader at the House, Democrat. They'd fight like cats and dogs during the day and the media and all that. And President Reagan would invite Tip over to the White House to the private quarters for a drink after Congress recessed, and have a drink, relax, talk. And they weren't just, surface level friends. They actually got along, enjoyed each other's company. President Nixon was friends with President Kennedy before either of them got to that office. They both knew each other, worked in Congress together, and actually enjoyed each other as friends. They actually got it. They would have a conversation. There's lots of people out there that actually, a lot of the problem going on in the country is that the engagement is adversarial as opposed to honest differences of perspective, understanding, appearance. And you have to sometimes you got to have a conversation. Why does a person see things a certain way, believe a certain thing? Who was it that actually had the conversations with Reagan, who began his political career as a Democrat, and eventually switched over to being a Republican, and then going all the way to the head of the Republican operations as president and governor of California?
I got a question about, you bring out Reagan. So we're talking to a savvy audience here. Was President Reagan compromised in any way? Or is he, as good as President Trump? Or not as good. Was he compromised in any way?
Well, I mean, Reagan was a Boy Scout. Reagan was a lifeguard. He actually was noted as having had a couple of rescues that saved people's life when he was a lifeguard. His father was an alcoholic, and he was raised, or had to raise himself at some level, caring for somebody that wasn't fully functional the way they needed to be. So he had a rescue mentality. Even when he was in Hollywood and then working with the other actors, he had kind of a leadership mentality to try and keep things on the rails and the jobs going for people staying, in their profession and acting. And then later as governor, steering California away from the rocks and keeping things moving. The 10th largest economy on planet Earth. If California was a country, it'd be the 10th largest nation on Earth economically. And then he moves on to the presidency. The issue for Reagan is he got certain promises from Congress. Those promises were that, for every dollar that they would generate in taxes, they had to cut, $2 in spending. That's why he signed the first budget bill. And then it didn't happen. Congress knifed him in the back. And he accepted him at that. He did something on the illegal situation coming into the country and gave a moratorium, allowed them all to come in one time. We're done with it. And now we're going to take care of the borders. And then they didn't do that to take care of the borders. He was giving the benefit of the doubt to Congress in so many ways that just wasn't being honored, coming back the way that it was, intended, promised, whatever. Even, his stance towards the Soviet Union, the evil empire which they were, the things that were going on in the Soviet Union in the 50s and 60s and 70s were really horrors. The religious persecution, the societal controls, the madness. Even Putin today talks about that era, Stalin, Gorbachev, I mean, Khrushchev, but also into Gorbachev. Putin talks about those as situations that can't be repeated, that were not defensible. So Reagan came in and said, trust but verify. They did some treaty work and tried to come to some agreements, and Russia wouldn't keep their promises. That's why we went in and dismantled them. We won the Cold War. We won World War III. Soviet Union doesn't exist. The Russia today has some similarities to the Russia of that period, but many, many, many things are vastly different than they were in that period. And Reagan gets a lot of credit for that in what was done. Was there mischief behind the scenes? You say, was he a captured person, or was he, a black hat, portraying himself as a white hat? Look, he had people in the intelligence agencies that were misusing and abusing their position. Bush, as vice president, was head of the Drug Interdiction Task Force. And much of that, having come from being director of CIA, there was all sorts of mischief that carried over behind the scenes into the Reagan administration. Who was really behind what became Iran-Contra? Well, that was Bush operations inside the White House that Reagan, he took the hit for it. The buck stops here. But in reality, those were people running operations in the basement of the White House that he was not fully aware of or read in on, and hadn't fully agreed to the way they ended up being done. The only other thing I'd add to that is, at that moment in time, in the late 70s and into the 80s, Russia and China both were running extremely proficient, well-organized operations to take control of governments across South America and economies across South America, hijacking the drug trade to themselves. And the contest was between our intelligence agency assets and their intelligence agency assets for control of those governments by covert means. And the drug war was central to that, because that was the cash flow. We could get the cash flow other ways in the banking and other things, but for Russia and China in that era, they needed the drug money and control to finance those operations. And that was this contest we were in South America. And it was because of those gun and money laundering operations and drug operations that we got into Iran-Contra. And then these things became exposed, showing the intelligence agencies' operations fighting this war, which were not, we had the Boland Amendment, where we couldn't spend money on arms without Congress's agreement to fight a war down there in the shadow of Vietnam. The people didn't want to get into another war, but yet you had people in the intelligence agencies that had a different attitude. And oh, by the way, George Bush won. The first Bush was very intricately involved in a lot of operation with all those players, but Reagan took the hit for things that were happening in the White House that were actually being run by the Bush crew. So if you wanted to say Reagan was a black cat, you're full of shit. If you wanted to say that there was some aspects of that administration that were captured from within, behind the scenes, that took America and our resources, military and intelligence and State Department operations, even banking, off track, then yes, you're right. I mean, that's the era where the various development finance authorities around the country became the money laundering operations for black bag operations for CIA and those corporations. Arkansas Development Finance Authority, Nebraska Development Finance Authority, Kentucky Development Finance Authority, all these various money laundering operations for the drug and gun running going into and out of South America that were the basis for what became known as Iran and Contra. And by the way, that continue today, that have evolved into what has been called Fast and Furious, which is far greater than just the stuff at the Mexican border that most people know about. These gun and drug operations, money laundering operations, are going on around the world. That's what Benghazi was all about, a gun running operation to get us started in the next war in Syria, moving weapons into Lebanon, Turkey, and Jordan. And now in this latest era, the stuff going on in the Ukraine, there's something percolating in the background that could break at any time now related to gun operations going into Ukraine and coming out of the Mideast, and then the players and the money involved even going into Russia. When that breaks, we will have, something that in conversations I've had over the last few weeks, I've kind of tried to put it somewhere in the zone of Iran Contra, but also the Gary Hart situation with a candidate and the girls, and the DeLorean situation with some setup to try and create a certain image for some of the players that really wasn't true. DeLorean was set up in a horrific situation because he was in a tough situation, and he became somebody's dupe for other things they had in mind. Destroyed, somebody that had real promise and was trying to do something very difficult and hard, and was really a victim in many ways. So anyway,
John DeLorean,
yeah.
Okay. So from what you're saying,
never had a personal interest in the car because it was underpowered and it wasn't a convertible. And I think but the era, you have to understand
mine's on the Cook right now.
All right. Well, my attitude is, in that era, they were trying to marshal us down to super economy cars and all that. He was trying to fit a certain thing. He was building a specialty car, but he ran into the same problem that Rambler had and stuff like that. Right idea, wrong time, and wasn't really his customers. He's dealing with a stylish thing. If he'd had a higher horsepower engine, and if and he was trying to do something unique with the gull wing doors, but they needed, even Tesla had to come up with a sports car with the top that goes down. Doesn't mean everybody's going to have that. It means that it sets a mental framework for how people view, but then they go back to the practical. So, it's stylish. Everybody likes it, likes that variation. And I got a version of it, but yes, it can carry the kids in the baby carriage too, or something. So anyway.
John DeLorean, Back to the Future, 176, Level Playing Field, 176, November the 5th, 176. Yeah, interesting. And obviously President Trump owns the, Trump National Bedminster is 283. That's the property of John DeLorean before President Trump bought it, isn't it? It's interesting. 88 miles per hour. 88. You have to The question, so when you said Tesla, I didn't think of Elon until about 3 or 4 seconds later. So when you said Tesla, I was thinking, that's brilliant. Nicola used to drive around in a convertible. I wonder if he did or does. And so I guess in terms of Reagan, a good-hearted guy, but if you go down I guess a coal mine, you're going to get a bit of soot on you. But from what you're saying, it seems like he's well-intentioned and couldn't do everything maybe he
Well, he
wanted
wasn't
to.
just well-intentioned. He wasn't just well-intentioned. You cannot diminish what Reagan did. He bought us a couple
I'm
of
not.
decades.
I'm just trying to get an accurate portrayal of what he did.
Reagan paved the way, bought us time to get Trump into the fight. These monsters, if Reagan hadn't been there, if he hadn't survived the assassination, we'd be 20 or 30 years further down the road into oblivion. We would not have won the Cold War. We would be already so deep in the mire of the menagerie that these people want us to live in, that I don't think we could have gotten out by now. He bought us time to get to this moment where the mechanisms of control are a bit more readily seen. And anybody that doesn't understand that is just not being honest with history. If the Soviet Union had continued to exist, the money that would have been spent into the military infrastructure would have been vastly more. And he brought it to a head. Reagan spent the money. We fought the war on multiple fronts. We did it in a religious war, on moral grounds. The Jews, many of them went to Israel. Look, Russian Jews are the majority of the population in Israel now, over 50%, I believe. Christians, especially Pentecostal, were brought out of Russia and got to the U.S. and other countries in the West. Russia itself went through an internal reform and changed the way that their government operates radically. They aren't, they're still a problem, but they're nothing like what they were back at the Cold War era. And we had Reagan bought us time to at least still be in the fight. And, around the world, people need to remember that.
Okay, cool. So if President Kennedy and President Trump were having dinner, Ronald would be a welcome guest. He'd be able to converse and they would thank him for the significant part he's played.
Absolutely. Oh my gosh, yes.
Good.
Yeah.
Good.
Yeah. If I had to tie the presidents that go together, look, you got to include Nixon in there.
I was going to say,
in this day and age,
this
day and age, people do not understand what Nixon accomplished. He's been vilified like they're trying to vilify Trump, and like they've tried to vilify Reagan. Nixon, what he accomplished in that era is actually stunning, and history will remember him well. In fact, if you like Trump, who got you Trump? Nixon did. Trump is Nixon's message in a bottle to the future. And he explained to him all the monsters that would come after him, where they were hiding, how they functioned, gave Trump a couple of key things that helped him to be part of going after the mob in New York, the five families. He was the unnamed source that allowed Giuliani. Why does he keep Giuliani around him? Because he's the one that gave Giuliani what he needed to take out the five families, get New York under control at some level. Didn't fix it completely, took out a huge portion of the monster. But why do you think the Southern District in New York is so adamant in going after Trump? That they know what that history is. So yeah, anyway.
Okay, yeah. The four of them, yeah. Very good. In terms of of Reagan's cabinet, and you talked about religious. So I know that a guy called Ezra Taft Benson, he was a Mormon prophet for a brief period, but I understand that the top of the Mormons got compromised. It seems like maybe Ezra Taft Benson wasn't, but he was part of Reagan's cabinet. I don't know if you've got any commentary or detail on him as a person in particular. He seemed to fight against kick against the pricks of the kind of establishment that was being formed there. I'm just wondering if he was similar to Reagan and trying to make a difference and do something significant, although he wasn't around for long once they put him in office.
I'm not really familiar with him specifically, and I don't, I wouldn't want to say something, that particular thing. I just don't have any personal, insights that would probably be appropriate or useful.
Okay. You talk as well of Nixon, and I don't know if this is real or not. I've seen pictures, but who knows what's real, when you see photographs. Roger Stone is a close friend of President Trump, and he appears to have a tattoo of Nixon on his back. Is that BS or is that real?
I believe that's real. This is my recollection on that. And, again, just as for Reagan, Nixon, people today have no concept of what was going on behind the scenes. Nixon came into power, and when he won the election in 68, took office in 69, he was immediately briefed on the largest covert intelligence gathering operation ever in the history of the planet, bigger than anything else done by any government anywhere up to that time on the planet, which was the K-129 situation, where a Russian sub came down north of Hawaii, tried to do a false flag simulating that it was a Chinese sub with nuclear missiles launching on Pearl Harbor. Nixon comes into office, gets read in on that, and then has to take the helm in that environment. It is the reason that Johnson decided not to run, to focus on what was going on there behind the scenes with what happened with this sub, and the knowledge. It was after he found out that this launch had been attempted on 3/11 of 1968, in that environment where Bobby Kennedy was assassinated. You had turmoil like most people just can't remember in that area. Kent State, the Tet Offensive, China and Russia both engaging us at the same time, a two-front war, if you will. Southeast Asian challenge, the drama that happened in Indonesia, where you had an internal conflict in Indonesia that most people today still have no concept. On the low side, 1 million. On the high side, 5 million people were killed in Indonesia in a civil unrest situation, that Southeast Asia area. Who was going to control that region of the world, the southern tip of Southeast Asia. And by the way, Nixon comes into power in that environment, and he's worried about trying to get things in the economy working right, trying to shut down Vietnam, the same as Kennedy wanted to get to some kind of a resolution that had a prayer of working. Remember, he was vice president under Eisenhower in the 50s, knew that area very well because we had the Korean conflict and related things, building up the Japanese intelligence agencies against the Chinese stuff with Mao and that group. Nixon was very familiar with all that. But he gets into office, he couldn't be read in beforehand. Once he's the president-elect, they start briefing him, bringing him up to speed. And then as soon as he's actually physically in the office, he gets the rest of the information. Oh, by the way, a Russian sub tried to fake that it was a Chinese sub and nuke Pearl Harbor. And so we've got to work this problem. And the negotiations begin with China. Look, if we don't communicate, if you're going to isolate yourself from the West, if we hadn't, if that sub hadn't blown up during launch phase, if that sub had successfully fired a nuclear missile into Pearl Harbor, we would have, because of various things that were done and the way this was done, we would have immediately responded and nuked a bunch of locations in China. That's why Kennedy didn't want to end up in a situation with a nuclear war. That's what Bay of Pigs was all about. And then the Cuban Missile Crisis. Kennedy didn't want to be responsible for the killing of millions of people presiding over World War III. Johnson comes in all hot and pushed by a bunch of military hawks into office to be their guy because Kennedy didn't want to escalate the Vietnam situation, does their bidding, and then lo and behold, he realizes he almost got set up to preside over World War III, and it drove him nuts. Literally, by some estimates, drove him mad. Smoking marijuana and growing his ponytail because he, just couldn't believe he almost became a bigger mass murderer than anybody in history. And presiding over World War III. Nixon comes into office, gets read in, and tries to do the diplomatic thing, get China to engage, find ways to bring China into a global conversation so that they weren't so readily or easily set up, and then supervises the lifting of a submarine off the seafloor 3.5 miles down. And in order to prove to the Chinese that it was actually a real submarine, they thought it was all illusion and a fraud. And so the lifting wasn't for the technology or like that. That wasn't the whole thing. It was to prove that it was actually the real thing. And if you look at the cost, yeah, it was monstrous. It was like doing a trip to Mars. That type of complexity, that type of expense. They did it and convinced the Chinese it was very real. That was a Russian sub. This is what it was real doing. It had real nuclear missiles. And that laid the basis for China opening up and agreeing to start engaging to avoid being set up in a false flag. And but it also, with anything big like that, it has lots of risks. Now, China is the problem it is today. That wasn't managed properly. You had monsters in the global political system. It's like a James Bond movie. And you have Spectre in there, and they have designs for global control. Anyway, I don't know if that helped. Nixon, an amazing person, complex, important, and the fact that he survived the takedown to be able to help this next phase into President Trump. He told him all the monsters that are coming after you, how they're hiding, where they're at, and what to watch out for. And good luck, and let's say a prayer. Here we are.
You said there were two things he gave President Trump, and then you talked about Giuliani and the five mafia families in New York. What was the other thing that he gave President Trump to help President Trump do what he's doing and has done now?
He passed the baton of those that invited Trump to run. That went back to post-World War II and through the Korean conflict, and then understanding the nature of the monster we were facing with this globalista, and you have an internal fight. Those that believe that continuity in government should go to senior executive service, and that crowd that's this covert shadow government, which Cheney, every time he had a fake heart attack, was going to help get set up. And that core group of general staff and admirals related to nuclear and beyond, and that thin component that is behind the rest of the fight back. That's, you know, what you don't realize or know, but is the whole reason we even have a prayer of winning at this point.
So that goes all the way back to World War II.
Yep.
I watched Oppenheimer.
Yeah.
I've seen Oppenheimer about 3 times now. Well, not about. I have seen it 3 times. Maybe the first 5 minutes when I first watched it, I missed, or the first 10, but I've seen it 3 times. And they mentioned, I said Christopher Nolan's a white hat director, and he mentions Kennedy in it and how Kennedy stood up against Strauss, who tried to take out Oppenheimer. And obviously the events of Oppenheimer were World War II. So a lot of people in the movement, you know, they feel that President Kennedy could be the, you know, inception of Q. But we're looking further, you know, before Kennedy was president, we're looking further back at World War II. And he was a young, either, what was he, a Congress? I get muddled up with my labeling for American
PT boat
politics.
captain. He was a PT boat captain. Yeah.
But
he was a real hero. He wasn't, you know, his PT boat actually was damaged, and he, with a broken back, went and swam miles in very difficult circumstances to save additional of his crew. Those people that survived that spoke, you know, about the incident, and what he did was an amazing feat. Mentally, physically, spiritually, did something stunning. And he was, you know, the book profiles in courage. That's real people talking about a real event, and the character of the person involved. You know, he had his failings, which seemed to almost be a family thing at some level, with the women, but within those types of circumstances, that incident, no one can take away the valor that occurred there, and the core of the man, and that's in large measure why he became president.
Balls of steel.
Beg pardon?
I said balls of steel. Bravery.
Yeah. Your accent made it hard for me to understand initially, and then I got it.
Oh, okay. Yeah.
Yeah. But you know, I think that if you look at what, you know, for example, 17th letter of the alphabet Q, doesn't just go back to World War II or something before that. The Q clearance having to do with the Department of Energy and nuclear weapons grade nuclear components and deployment and things like that. It goes back all the way, 17th book of the Bible, Esther. The flip, the reversal, the boomerang. There's a reason why the Esther book is the 17th book of the Bible. 17 down through history has always been a number denoting victory. And the question then becomes, for whose side? See, the first half of the Esther book, more than the first half, is all the setup, understanding the nature of the environment which Esther was raised in, and which the Jews found themselves in Persia. And then at the flip, the reversal, the ability of the people to begin to fight back, to prepare to fight back, and then a great conflict, a cataclysm, and engagement. And at the end of that engagement, most people don't understand. If they do understand Esther, they just think of it as one event. No, there was the reversal of the change in direction where the king's power, his signet ring, his authority, was used by Haman, the King Xerxes. Let me just say, Esther was one of his wives. He had lots of wives, and very powerful kingdom, arguably the biggest at the time at that point in the world. In a prior period, just a few dozens of years earlier, Persia, the Medes and the Persians had conquered Babylon, the biggest, most powerful nation on the planet at that point in time. And so Persia was a great empire. And the king of Persia, King Xerxes, he had,
Say again, please. One, you cut out there. The king.
No, Zoom doesn't let me block the calls when they come in, so somebody called in. King Xerxes, being king of this huge empire, one of the ways that, the kings would...
And Esther was one of his wives, or Esther was married to someone else?
No, Esther was one of his wives. And the whole point was the king would have pick of the litter, for wives. And a lot of times they'd bring in, women from other regions to be a wife. And it showed consolidation with that region because one of the wives was from a particular tribe or family or something like that. And they had a beauty contest. The previous queen hadn't been, honoring to the king as she's supposed to be. And so she was put away and they had a beauty contest. And she was the prettiest of the bunch, Esther was. And I've done huge presentations on the Esther stuff. But there was this party that she threw. Haman had got, the king was a drunk and really liked his alcohol, liked to party, liked all of his wives, etc. Wasn't paying attention to running the kingdom. So this lieutenant within his operation, Haman, does a good enough job of running things. The king says, hey, look, I don't want to be bothered with all this administration stuff. Look, here's my ring. You have my permission to run things. You got a question, ask me, but just get the details done and don't be bothered all the time. It's just annoying. And so Haman is administering things, and then at a certain point, this other cultural group was competing in the kingdom for the king's attention, for commerce, for trade, and all this stuff. And that was the Jews. And so Haman, being from a different group and tribe, decides, okay, we're done with it. He's got all of his advisors. He has the power of the king's ring. He says, okay, let's make a law that says on a certain date, anybody that kills Jews can have all their property and have their wives, their daughters, whatever. You just have to kill all the guys. And so there's a date certain that's set, and then it's sent out as a royal decree in the king's name. The king's so drunk, partying and everything else, he doesn't even know this happened. So Esther, being a Jew, but not the king not realizing it, even Haman, this bad guy, not realizing what her tribe was, she is hit up by her people. Mordecai, the head of the Jews there in the country, he goes to her, he's a relative, and says, look, you got to help us. You got to convince the king. You got to do something. And she prays about it. She's like, oh my gosh, what am I supposed to do? I'm just, one of the wives. I'm here as a sex slave. I'm here as an ornament. I don't have any control over what the king does. Shoot, he hasn't even called on me. He's got so many girlfriend, wives, concubines that I haven't even seen him in over a month. And you want me to go tell him to do something? Are you kidding me? Only way I could approach was if he calls me. She eventually decides to do something, throws a couple of parties in a row, has all the harem girls show up at Harem Girl House at throws a big party. The king loves it, has him come back a second night. On the second night, Mordecai, at his wife's beholding, because you got a bunch of women in this thing, Mordecai's wife has told him, you got to get rid of that. I mean, Haman's wife has told him, you got to get rid of that Mordecai, the head of the Jews. He's your problem. If you get rid of him, you have a smooth sailing till you have extermination date for the Jews. And that's coming up in a few months. And, the context is when Haman did this, he probably did it for a year out for various reasons. These intervening weeks or months go by. Esther has this big party, has King Xerxes in, and at the end of the second party, at a certain point, the king asks Esther, who's one of his wives, is his favorite wife because she's so beautiful, and says, okay, you threw these parties. It was a great drunk. Really enjoyed it. What can I do for you? I know you have something in mind. What do you want? Just like all guys knowing the women have a real reason why they're getting an extra nice dinner that night or a cookie. And so Esther says, well, the reality is you signed a decree, or the people around you had you a decree signed that says all the Jews must die. And oh, by the way, I'm a Jew. And Xerxes, what? You're my favorite wife. What are you talking about? Yeah, I'm supposed to be exterminated at the end of the year. And so I'm set for death. And all of my people are also. And your signet ring was used to sign the decree. Well, the king's drunk, he's high, he's had a great party, and all the harem girls have been great, and he's getting ready to go to bed with one of them. And all of a sudden he has to sober up. What?
Just one?
Say this
I'm
again?
sure it would have been a few more from the sounds of it.
Yeah. Well, so he sobers up a bit. He's so shocked by what he just heard that he has to step out onto the back porch at Harem Girl House and catch his breath. And of course, he's the king. He has a military guard with him everywhere he goes. And he steps out in the back porch, and out in the background is a hangman's device. Now, not a noose like we have today. In Persia at that time, they would literally take a spike or a stick tree and jam it up the rectum. And then they had a way of hoisting this long pole up vertically. And so you would hang on a pole up high where everybody could see you, this tall pole, 30, 40 feet tall. And you would die a slow, excruciating death sliding down onto that pole through your innards on that spike. And so he sees this out the back door as he's catching his breath on the rear porch. He asks one of the guards, what's this doing here? This is Harem Girl House. We don't, what's that doing there? Who made that? And the guard tells him Haman had it constructed, and after the party tonight, he's going to have Mordecai, the head of the Jews, killed on that right there. Well, Mordecai and Haman have both been at the party together. They've both been laughing. They've both been yucking it up. Mordecai was a guest, as Haman was a guest at this party at Harem Girl House to be entertained, have some music and strip shows and whatever else going on. And so the king is, he's been drunk, having a good time, had a big meal, he's half asleep, and now he's got to sober up. His mind is reeling. During this same time, while he's on the porch, inside the house, Haman has run over to Esther. You can't tell him about this thing. You've got to tell him, not to worry about it. I'll take care of it. And he grabs onto Esther's skirt because he knows he's in deep kimchi, he's in deep shit. And when the king sobers up and realizes that he had it set up for Esther to be killed and Mordecai to be killed and all the Jews to be killed, you know, Haman, the king has a short temper. At the beginning of the 17th book of the Bible, Esther, it talks about the previous queen, how she snubbed the king a little bit on doing a special dance, the Seven Veils dance or whatever, for guests when he had a big party with all the regional rulers there. You know, literally a 1 year long party with all, you know, it wasn't easy to travel in those days, long distances. And so, you know, what we would travel in a day in a car might take a week on foot, or two, might take a month. So all these prefects and rulers from around the kingdom would come in for a big party. At the highlight of the party, King Xerxes wanted to show off his wife doing her special nudie dance or something and entertain him. And she just didn't feel like it. She'd been partying for months, and this was the last thing for the locals, and she just didn't think they were worthy of her presence or something. And it so upset the king that he had her taken out as queen, and then he had this beauty party where Esther became, you know, the queen after this long pageant thing that took months. So with that in mind, he had a very short, rash personality. And Haman knew that he could be rash. Even giving his signet ring to Haman was a rash move. He'd do things on the spur of the moment. He was very impetuous. So Haman knew he was in instant danger, that if the king came back in that door and wasn't happy with him after he'd sobered up on the porch, something horrible could happen to him. He could be killed. He had a premonition, because that's exactly what happened. When the king came back off the deck and came in the door at that exact instant, it just so happened that Haman was holding on to Esther's skirts, was beside her, pleading with her to not, you know, tell the king what had transpired. The king didn't even ask Esther what was going on, didn't ask anyone else. He saw Haman holding Esther, grabbing onto her, thought he was assaulting her, and instantly ordered the guards to seize him and then take him out and kill him on the device that he had built for Mordecai. That's the flip. That's the reversal. That's the boomerang, as Roseanne Barr says, you know, the boomerang. And she envisions herself as a modern day Esther, by the way. And I think she is. She's a good friend. So then Haman is taken out and put to death in this gruesome way. He wanted to rule over Persia, surreptitiously via the authorities given to him by King Xerxes. And he did. He got to rise up above all of Persia there at the capital on a spike, dying a slow, excruciating death. And it was brutal on that hangman's device. Then the king, sobering up, turns to Esther, doesn't know what to do. How do I fix this? Asks Mordecai. And Mordecai says, well, a king can't reverse his ruling, because that's the law. Once he said it, it's done. If he was to reverse it, it would say that he was wrong in the first place. So because it was done in his name, didn't matter. It was his authority that was done under. So he amended the law, didn't change it. He added to it and said that the Jews, in the intervening period from that day until the date certain when the fight was on, could arm themselves and make allies. And that anybody that aligned with the Jews did not have to worry about facing any consequences for it, that wasn't against the law. So then the Jews used that intervening period, Mordecai and all the rest of them, to make business agreements, land agreements, trade agreements, pacts for arming and protection, etc., against the family of Haman and all of the people around Haman who wanted to go to war that that date certain that was in the future. When the date came, the Jews, totally overwhelmed. Haman's 10 sons were out for revenge for their mother and for their father, and they were seized. And in the Jewish lore, they all died in the same breath. All their throats were slit at the exact same moment. And this fight went on for a long day. At the end of that day, there was still some unfinished business. King Xerxes asked Esther, did you get everything you want? Mordecai advised her there was still some fighting in certain regions that wasn't completed. And the king extended the fight for another day. And then it was all finished. And they had a big party afterwards because the Jews, under Mordecai's lead, with Esther's assistance, had won this battle against their enemies, who they didn't start the battle, but they finished it. And then the legend is that Esther had a child by Xerxes whose name was Darius. And down through time, Darius, a son of Darius, actually allowed the Jews to go back and rebuild their kingdom, put walls around Jerusalem, and start over again and come out of captivity. And Darius was the name. There's one of the great saints in the early church was Darius, who refused to be part of this Roman tradition that happens at what's our time of year, Christmas, but was actually the Saturn festival, worshiping the god Saturn at the midwinter festival, the winter solstice, and wouldn't be part of that whole game. I've written articles about that. And so the whole point of this is 17 is the number of reversals. Esther is the symbol of reversals. And it's not just one date certain, but it's a turning point event, which was the day that Haman died on a hangman's device of his own creation. And then the intervening period when the people consolidated and then came against the much larger enemy with this fight that was, we celebrate with this change of reversal. Here right now in the United States, and I know you have an international audience, we've been taking punches. Trump, has been charged and charged and charged. That's the in the lower corner. The name of this art is the charge, El Magador, and my lovely, beautiful, wonderful wife made that art based on presentations I did a year and a half ago on Trump as the Megador, the Matador. We've taken a lot of hits. Trump's gotten all these charges against him. When are we going to do the counterpunch? Even Ali, who did rope-a-dope and absorbed the hits from a very powerful opponent, several of them actually, then came back, eventually had to come out of his role, absorbing the punches, letting the opponent duke it out, wear himself down, and then started to do the fight back against an opponent that was already slower and used up in many ways, and take it back to him. The counterpunch is coming. It's not too far off now. And it's not over then, just like it wasn't over with Haman. We now have the fight back to this final standoff within these globalista and political opponents. The Russia stuff is where we'll start, and those people involved in that. And then we'll move on to Ukraine. And they haven't given up. We're not going to accept that. We're in the fight back. That guy right there is at the point, and he's Nixon's messenger in a bottle to this generation.
Well, thank you, Juan. A lot of good things there. Thank you. 17, the number of reversals, 355. Remember the 5th of
I'm going to
November.
name my next cookie, my next cookie creation. I'm going to name it the 17 cookie.
There you go, the 17 cookie. Good. Well, hang on, let's see what this is.
By the way, Jennifer just got these blankets made. This is a Sherpa blanket, and it's awesome. I just love it. She has this one and one that has the called imagery on it from our movie, The Called, The Makings of a Perfect Day. And I love this imagery because that's the deep state bull, and Trump is the Megador, the Matador, going to war, single combat with these monsters. And I think it's the imagery that we'll remember out in the future.
Oh, you got the cue there. I can see it.
Well, yeah. So,
Yeah.
you know, and then there's the deep state brand on the bull. You know, the thing that's fun with these. So I got friends that are going to, you know, in the fall here, we have football and basketball games. I mean, football and baseball games that we're going to the stadiums and all that. And a lot of times they're afternoon or evening games and all that. So you take your blanket and your jacket and you go to the game. Well, imagine how much fun our guys are going to have flying the flag, wearing their jacket and throw the blanket over their shoulders or across them while they're at the game. It's kind of fun matching stuff. And, you know, you have to fly the flag of your team. And it's becoming more and more apparent where this is going. They tried to hoodwink America over who won the election and through various frauds. And the reality is Trump won the election, and it's becoming more and more apparent to everybody. And now we're working through the legal side to get back to resolving this. In fact, the threat of going to a 2024 election is fairly serious. I don't think the election happens on time. We have a little bit of a pause while we sort things out. And of course, we have the song Jennifer and I have sung. She wrote it, 2020, it's not over yet. It's actually a longer song than that. I think we have it on the YouTube somewhere or the social media somewhere, but it's a very fun song. I should have her repost it again over there at Telegram or something. But anyway, it's just, you know, keep your eyes peeled. We're far from over with where we're at. There's all sorts of developments happening even now. So.
Good stuff. Well, thanks, Juan.
And by the way, you can get the blankets and all that over at thejennifermac.com. So and if you're outside the U.S., there's a link there, I think, that helps you to order outside the U.S. That there's another company that does the mailings and all that. But I'm just telling you, that blanket is awesome. It's a very warm, cool blanket. So anyway, just an aside.
Good. Get your blankets, everyone. All right, my friend. Thank you. It's a tricky business that we're involved in, but we'll get there.
Yeah.
Question. There's always why. I do question why. I'm always thinking why, but
well, why what? Why what? And control, even trying to take us to nuclear war here as a country and as a planet, and that is ahead. But the counterpunch and the fight back are coming now very, very quickly. And the people around the world, people within your audience, should be aware that 17 is the number. It goes both ways. For example, you mentioned with President Kennedy, the gravesite for President Kennedy is sealed with a Q, 17th letter of the alphabet. That's the walkway around the gravesite. That's no accident. That was intentional. It's the number of victory. But both sides want to own that number of victory. It's like 5 is the number of grace to God's people. But for the devil and his crowd, 5 is the number of death to enemies and defense. That's why the Pentagon has 5 sides. It has symbolic meaning. So there's symbolic meaning in the way that the grave of President Kennedy is sealed in, to seal in that energy and stamp it with a boot stamp of that crowd. We have the victory over you. 17 cuts both ways. It can also be the reversal, the Esther moment, as we take out this globalista cabal who seek to enslave the whole planet, take it their direction. They want to wipe out 13 out of 14 people alive today. That's what the global or the Georgia Guidestones were all about. The carrying capacity of the planet's only 500 million, according to these monsters. So we have to get rid of everybody. That's why you have to have planet wars and even a nuclear conflict. They want to cull the herd so they can own the direction of the planet for the next thousands of years. Their 1,000-year millennial reign. They're not